Time moves differently for those left behind. In Charlottesville, Virginia, October nights still carry the echo of a question that haunted a community for 6 years. A young woman walked into the darkness outside a concert venue and never returned home. Her name was Morgan Harrington, and her disappearance fractured the safe assumptions of college life forever. What began as a simple mistake stepping outside for fresh air with no way back in became one of Virginia's most agonizing cold cases. For years, her parents carried her memory like a flame, refusing to let it dim. Investigators preserved evidence in storage boxes, waiting for technology to catch up with their determination. The community moved forward, but never moved on. Then, in 2014, another young woman vanished. Surveillance cameras captured her final moments walking with a stranger through downtown streets. When DNA evidence connected both cases to a third attack, a 6-year mystery exploded into a race for justice that would shock everyone who thought they knew their neighbors. How long can evil hide in plain sight before science finally brings it to light? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. October air in Virginia carries promises of change. On the evening of October 17, 2009, those promises felt golden to Morgan Dana Harrington as she stepped out of her car in the John Paul Jones Arena parking lot. Metallica had come to Charlottesville, and for a 20-year-old Virginia Tech student with adventure in her heart, this was everything she'd hoped for. Morgan's blonde hair caught the amber glow of arena lights as she met up with her 3 friends. They'd driven down from Blacksburg together, their excitement building with each mile. The massive venue hummed with anticipation as 16,000 fans converged for a rare Virginia performance by the legendary metal band. "I can't believe we're actually here," Morgan laughed, adjusting her Black Pantera t-shirt and knee-high boots. Her friends snapped photos near the entrance, capturing her radiant smile moments before the concert began. She looked exactly like what she was, a vibrant young woman embracing life with both hands. Inside, the arena pulsed with energy. The opening acts had warmed up the crowd, and now, the main event was beginning. Morgan danced and sang along, her voice lost in the thunderous chorus of thousands. Everything felt perfect, everything felt safe. By 8:30, the concert was in full swing, but Morgan needed a break. The crowd was intense, the air thick with excitement and body heat. She told her friends she was stepping out to find a restroom and maybe get some fresh air. It was a decision that seemed completely ordinary at the time. Security footage later showed her walking through the arena's exit doors at 8:20 p.m. What she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that the venue's strict no re-entry policy meant this simple choice would change everything. Outside, the October night had turned crisp. Morgan tried to get back in, but security was firm. No exceptions. No re-entry. She called her friends inside, her voice calm, but tinged with frustration. "I'm locked out," she told them, "but don't worry, I'll figure something out." Her friends offered to leave with her, but Morgan insisted they stay and enjoy the show. She was resourceful. She was smart. She would find her way back to Blacksburg, maybe catch a ride with someone else heading that direction. It was only an hour drive. What could go wrong? The music continued thundering inside the arena, while Morgan stood alone under the parking lot lights, her phone glowing as she scrolled through her contacts, looking for a solution to what seemed like a minor inconvenience. The Copeley Road Bridge stretched across the darkness like a lifeline between the arena and the main campus. Morgan had decided to walk toward the University of Virginia, hoping to find a friend, or maybe catch a ride back to Virginia Tech. Her boots clicked rhythmically on the pavement as she crossed the bridge, the concert's bass still vibrating faintly in the distance. At 9:30 p.m., she made another phone call, this time to a friend in Harrisonburg. Her voice was steady, optimistic even. She said, "I'll get a ride home somehow. Don't worry about me." But witnesses later reported seeing a young woman in a Black Pantera shirt trying to hitchhike near the bridge. Some drivers slowed down, considering whether to stop. Others kept going, thinking about their own safety, or simply not wanting to get involved. It was late. It was dark, and there was something unsettling about picking up strangers, even in a college town that generally felt safe. The distinctive t-shirt, the knee-high boots, the blonde hair, these details would become burned into the memories of those who saw her. One driver would later tell police he almost stopped but decided against it. The regret would haunt him for years. Cars passed by with increasing frequency as the concert began to wind down. Morgan waited, her breath visible in the cooling air, still believing that her night would end safely, that she would wake up in her own bed tomorrow with nothing but a story to tell about the concert she almost saw. Dawn broke gray and cold over Charlottesville on October 18th. Inside the arena parking lot, Morgan's friends searched frantically among the remaining cars, their optimism from the night before curdling into real fear. Morgan's black Nissan sat exactly where she'd left it, but she was nowhere to be found. That afternoon, arena maintenance workers made a discovery that sent chills through everyone involved in the search. Morgan's purse lay on the ground near the parking lot, its contents scattered but deliberate. Her cell phone was there, along with her identification and keys. Nothing appeared to be missing, but everything was wrong. The items were positioned too neatly to have been dropped accidentally. Someone had placed them there, someone who wanted them to be found. Charlottesville police launched missing person protocols immediately. The arena was canvassed. Witnesses were interviewed. Security footage was reviewed frame by frame. Morgan had definitely exited the building at 8:20 p.m., but after that, the trail went cold. Her parents, Dan and Gil Harrington, drove down from their home in Roanoke that evening, their hearts heavy with a dread they couldn't yet name. Dan, a respected physician, approached the situation with clinical precision, asking detailed questions about the investigation. Gil, an elementary school teacher, spoke to reporters with the patient clarity she used with her students, even as her world was falling apart. Morgan is a smart, capable young woman, Gil told the cameras. She wouldn't just disappear. Someone knows something. The first missing person posters went up that night, Morgan's radiant smile reproduced on hundreds of pieces of paper that would soon blanket the area. By late October, the search for Morgan Harrington had become one of the largest missing person efforts in Virginia history. Hundreds of volunteers combed through forests, fields, and ravines around Charlottesville. State police helicopters swept overhead, while teams on foot searched every conceivable hiding place. The FBI entered the case, offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to Morgan's safe return. In an unprecedented move, Metallica themselves doubled the reward, with the band members expressing their profound concern for the young woman who had disappeared from their concert. Tips poured in from across the state. Every sighting was investigated. Every lead was followed. Surveillance footage from gas stations, restaurants, and traffic cameras was reviewed with microscopic attention to detail. The footage confirmed what they already knew: Morgan had left the arena voluntarily, but after 8:30 p.m., she seemed to have vanished from the earth. The University of Virginia community rallied around the search effort. Students organized search parties, faculty members posted flyers, local businesses displayed Morgan's photo in their windows. The case became a shared obsession, a mystery that everyone felt compelled to solve. But as October turned to November, and November slipped toward December, hope began to feel more fragile. Dan and Gil Harrington appeared on national television, their faces etched with exhaustion, but their voices still strong. They would not give up. They would not stop searching. They would not let their daughter be forgotten. Winter settled over Virginia like a heavy blanket, covering the search areas with frost and making outdoor investigation nearly impossible. The volunteers went home. The news crews moved on to other stories, but the Harringtons kept vigil, and somewhere in the darkness, the truth waited to be discovered. January 26, 2010, dawned cold and clear. David Bass, a farmer in Albemarle County, was walking his property on Anchorage Farm Road when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Scattered across a remote corner of his land, about 10 miles from the arena where Morgan had last been seen, were human remains. The call to police came at 10:15 a.m. Within hours, the field was swarming with investigators, forensic experts, and crime scene technicians. Yellow tape fluttered in the winter wind as they worked methodically to recover every piece of evidence from the frozen ground. Dental records confirmed what everyone had feared, but hoped would never come. The remains were those of Morgan Dana Harrington. After 3 months of desperate searching, the missing person case had become a homicide investigation. The autopsy revealed the brutal truth. Morgan had died from blunt force trauma to the head. Evidence also confirmed she had been sexually assaulted before her death. The medical examiner estimated she had been killed shortly after her disappearance, meaning that all those weeks of searching, all those sleepless nights of hoping, had been time spent looking for someone who was already gone. Dan and Gil Harrington held each other as detectives delivered the news they had dreaded. Their daughter, their only child, their bright light, had been murdered by someone who remained completely unknown. The randomness of it felt like a second blow. There was no clear motive, no obvious suspect, no relationship to explain what had happened. The discovery transformed the investigation entirely. This was no longer about finding a missing person. This was about catching a killer who had taken a young woman's life and then melted back into the shadows as if nothing had happened. In the sterile environment of the Virginia State Crime Lab, forensic technicians began the painstaking process of analyzing evidence recovered from Anchorage Farm. Every fiber, every trace of DNA, every microscopic clue was cataloged and tested using the most advanced technology available. What they discovered sent ripples of recognition through law enforcement agencies across the state. The DNA profile extracted from evidence related to Morgan's murder matched an unsolved case from 2005, a brutal sexual assault in Fairfax County that had haunted investigators for years. The 2005 victim had survived her attack, providing detailed testimony about her assailant. She described a large black man who had approached her on a Saturday morning as she walked to a grocery store. He had seemed friendly at first, offering to help with directions, before violently attacking her behind the apartment building. Despite extensive investigation, no arrest had ever been made. Now, 5 years later, that cold case was suddenly connected to Morgan Harrington's murder. The DNA evidence was unambiguous. The same man who had attacked the Fairfax victim had killed Morgan. Investigators were dealing with a serial offender, someone who had been operating in Virginia for at least 5 years. The revelation was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it provided a concrete lead and suggested the killer might strike again, potentially leaving more evidence. Terrifying because it meant a violent predator had been moving freely through Virginia communities for years, attacking women when the opportunity arose. Media coverage exploded with speculation about a serial killer stalking Virginia women. Parents kept their daughters closer. University campuses increased security patrols. But the killer's identity remained as mysterious as ever. The DNA profile sat in databases, waiting for a match that might never come. The years between 2010 and 2014 became a study in persistence against impossible odds. Morgan's case officially went cold, joining thousands of other unsolved murders across the country. The DNA evidence was preserved carefully, the case files maintained meticulously, but active investigation slowed to a crawl as other crimes demanded attention. Dan and Gil Harrington refused to let their daughter's memory fade. They established the Help Save the Next Girl Foundation, channeling their grief into advocacy for campus safety and support for other families dealing with missing persons cases. Gil became a powerful public speaker, her teacher's instincts helping her connect with audiences across the country. The foundation's work kept Morgan's story alive in ways that purely criminal investigation could not. They pushed for better lighting on campus walkways, improved emergency communication systems, and enhanced safety protocols at large venues. Every improvement felt like a small victory in Morgan's memory. Meanwhile, the DNA profile from Morgan's case continued its silent vigil in law enforcement databases. Investigators would periodically review the file, hoping that new technology or a fresh perspective might yield breakthrough insights. The Fairfax survivor remained ready to testify if a suspect was ever identified, her courage sustained by the hope that justice might finally come. The case had become something larger than a single investigation. It was a symbol of every family's worst fears, every parent's nightmare about the dangers their children might face. Morgan's photo remained posted in police stations and on websites, her smile a constant reminder that somewhere, someone knew what had happened to her. But as 2014 began, there was no indication that 6 years of waiting were about to end in the most unexpected way possible. September 13, 2014, started like any other Saturday night in Charlottesville. Students filled the bars and restaurants around the University of Virginia campus, enjoying the warm evening and the promise of weekend freedom. Among them was Hannah Graham, and one 8-year-old sophomore with her whole life ahead of her. Hannah had been out with friends earlier but had become separated from her group around midnight. Security cameras throughout downtown Charlottesville captured her movements as she walked alone through the busy streets, past McGrady's pub, past Tempo restaurant, searching for familiar faces or a safe way home. The footage showed her interacting with several people, but one encounter stood out. Near the Tempo restaurant, cameras captured Hannah walking with a large black man in a white t-shirt. They appeared to be talking casually as they moved together down the sidewalk and out of the camera's range. When Hannah failed to return to her dorm that night, her friends contacted police immediately. The community's response was swift and overwhelming, shaped by the painful memory of Morgan Harrington's disappearance 5 years earlier. No one wanted to watch another family endure that agony. The surveillance footage became the focus of intense investigation. Police released images of the man seen walking with Hannah, asking for public assistance in identifying him. The images were grainy but clear enough to show distinctive features: his size, his clothing, his general appearance. Within days, tips began pouring in. Someone recognized the man in the footage. Someone knew exactly who he was. And when investigators learned his identity, they realized they might finally have the break that Morgan Harrington's case had been waiting for all these years. Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. had been hiding in plain sight for years. A 2-year-old hospital worker at the University of Virginia Medical Center, he was known to colleagues as quiet but friendly, a former college football player who had settled into a routine life in Charlottesville. His job gave him access to the hospital and the broader university community. His familiarity with the area went back years. When police identified Matthew as the man seen walking with Hannah Graham, they moved quickly to obtain a warrant for his DNA. The sample was rushed to the state crime lab for comparison against evidence from several unsolved cases, including Morgan Harrington's murder. The results changed everything. Matthew's DNA matched the profile from Morgan's case perfectly. It also matched the 2005 Fairfax assault. After 9 years of investigation, 6 years of waiting, and countless dead ends, the predator who had terrorized 3 women had finally been identified. The news sent shockwaves through Charlottesville and beyond. Jesse Matthew had been living and working in the community for years, interacting daily with potential victims, while his crimes went undetected. He had passed background checks, maintained employment, and appeared to live a normal life while harboring violent impulses that had already claimed at least one life. Police moved swiftly to arrest Matthew, but he had already disappeared. His apartment was empty, his car was gone, and he seemed to have vanished as suddenly as his victims had. The manhunt that followed would span multiple states and capture national attention as law enforcement agencies coordinated to track down a suspect who had proven remarkably adept at avoiding detection. The chase ended 1,300 miles away on a beach in Galveston, Texas. On September 24, 2014, Texas state troopers spotted Jesse Matthews' car parked near the shoreline and found him camping on the beach. He surrendered without resistance, appearing almost relieved that his time as a fugitive had come to an end. Extradition proceedings moved swiftly. Matthew was flown back to Virginia under heavy security, facing charges in multiple jurisdictions for crimes spanning nearly a decade. The man who had terrorized 3 women and murdered at least one was finally in custody. In Charlottesville, the arrest brought a complex mix of emotions: relief that a dangerous predator was off the streets, anger that he had been free for so long, grief for the families whose lives had been shattered by his violence, and a sobering recognition that evil could indeed hide behind the most ordinary facade. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. DNA samples taken after Matthew's arrest confirmed what investigators already knew: he was definitively linked to the Fairfax assault, Morgan's murder, and Hannah Graham's disappearance. The probability of error was virtually non-existent. For Dan and Gil Harrington, the arrest marked the end of 6 years of terrible uncertainty. They would finally learn what had happened to their daughter. They would finally see her killer face justice in court. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that justice could never restore what had been taken from them. The case that had begun with a young woman stepping outside for fresh air was about to enter its final phase, as prosecutors prepared to seek justice for crimes that had haunted Virginia for nearly a decade. Fairfax County prosecutors moved first, filing charges related to the 2005 sexual assault. The survivor, now nearly a decade older, remained willing to testify despite the trauma of reliving her attack. Her courage would become the foundation for a case that connected 3 separate crimes across multiple jurisdictions. Pretrial proceedings revealed disturbing details about Matthew's past. He had been disciplined at the University of Virginia years earlier for sexual misconduct, but had been allowed to transfer to another school rather than face serious consequences. The pattern of institutional protection that had enabled his continued predation became a subject of intense scrutiny. Defense attorneys struggled with an impossible case. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Matthew's flight from Virginia after being identified suggested consciousness of guilt. Multiple victims across multiple years established a clear pattern of violent behavior. There was no credible defense strategy that could overcome the forensic evidence. As legal proceedings continued, prosecutors in Charlottesville prepared murder charges for both Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham. The cases would likely be tried separately, but the evidence overlapped significantly. Matthew's DNA linked all 3 crimes in ways that defense attorneys could not explain away. The legal process moved with unusual efficiency, driven by overwhelming evidence, and Matthew's inability to mount any credible defense. Behind the scenes, plea negotiations began, as defense attorneys recognized that trial would likely result in death sentences for the murder charges. For the families involved, the legal proceedings brought both hope for justice and anxiety about the painful details that would emerge during trial. Every court appearance was a reminder of what they had lost and what could never be recovered. The midpoint revelation came during a routine court hearing in Fairfax County. Prosecutors presented their forensic evidence to the judge, methodically explaining how DNA analysis had connected Jesse Matthew to 3 separate crimes, spanning nearly a decade. The presentation was clinical, but its implications were staggering. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the state's lead forensic analyst, testified that the probability of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Matthew was less than 1 in several billion. The genetic markers from the 2005 Fairfax assault, Morgan's 2009 murder, and evidence from Hannah Graham's case were identical across multiple testing platforms. "In my 23 years of forensic analysis," Dr. Martinez told the court, "I have never seen such clear and consistent DNA evidence across multiple cases. There is no scientific doubt about the connection." The defense had no response to the genetic evidence. Their only option was to question collection procedures and chain of custody, but 9 years of careful evidence preservation had made those challenges virtually impossible to sustain. In the gallery, Gil Harrington gripped her husband's hand as the scientific details of their daughter's murder were presented with dispassionate precision. Each fact felt like both vindication and fresh trauma proof that justice was finally possible, but also stark confirmation of the violence that had ended Morgan's life. Media coverage exploded with headlines about the serial predator who had been unmasked by advances in DNA technology. The case became a symbol of both investigative persistence and the potential for science to solve crimes that had seemed unsolvable. With overwhelming evidence against him in Fairfax County, prosecutors in Charlottesville moved forward with murder charges for Morgan's case. The indictment was handed down in March 2015, formally charging Jesse Matthew with capital murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault in connection with Morgan Harrington's death. The charges carried the possibility of death penalty, but prosecutors indicated they would consider plea negotiations if Matthew was willing to provide details about the crimes and spare families the trauma of extended trials. Crime scene reconstruction experts had developed a theory about Morgan's final hours. They believed she had accepted a ride from Matthew somewhere near the Copeley Bridge, probably thinking she was getting safe transportation back to Virginia Tech. Instead, Matthew had driven her to a remote location where he assaulted and killed her before dumping her body at Anchorage Farm. The timeline fit perfectly with witness reports and surveillance footage. Matthew's familiarity with the Charlottesville area, gained through years of living and working there, had enabled him to choose locations where he was unlikely to be observed or interrupted. For Dan and Gil Harrington, seeing their daughter's killer formally charged with her murder brought a measure of closure they had thought might never come. But it also meant confronting the specific details of how Morgan had died, facts that no parent should ever have to learn. The foundation they had built in Morgan's memory had grown into a national organization promoting campus safety and supporting families of missing persons. Their work had literally saved lives by improving safety protocols and emergency response systems across the country. Hannah Graham's remains were discovered in October 2014, about a month after Matthew's arrest. The location was another remote area of Albemarle County, consistent with the pattern established in Morgan's case. Her death was ruled a homicide, and Matthew was charged with capital murder in connection with her death as well. The discovery of Hannah's body provided forensic confirmation of what investigators had already suspected. DNA evidence from her remains matched samples taken from Matthew after his arrest, definitively linking him to her murder. With charges pending in 3 separate cases, Matthew faced the possibility of multiple death sentences. The cumulative weight of evidence across all 3 cases made his guilt virtually certain, but the legal process still required careful prosecution and adherence to constitutional protections. Public reaction to the charges was intense. The University of Virginia community struggled with the knowledge that a predator had been operating in their midst for years. Campus safety became a central concern, with new protocols implemented for late-night activities and emergency response. The broader community grappled with questions about how Matthew had evaded detection for so long. His background checks for hospital employment had not revealed his violent tendencies. His interactions with law enforcement had been minimal. He had been, in many ways, the perfect hidden predator. Media attention focused on the role of DNA evidence in solving cold cases. The technology that had been experimental when Morgan was murdered had become sophisticated enough to provide definitive identification from trace evidence preserved for years. As 2016 began, defense attorneys faced an impossible situation. Jesse Matthew was connected by irrefutable DNA evidence to 3 violent crimes. His flight from Virginia, after being identified, suggested consciousness of guilt. There was no credible alternative explanation for the evidence. Plea negotiations intensified as both sides recognized that trials would be expensive, traumatic for the families, and likely to result in death sentences. Matthew's attorneys approached prosecutors with an offer guilty pleas in exchange for life sentences, without possibility of parole. The proposal created difficult decisions for prosecutors and families. Trials would provide public vindication and detailed accounting of Matthew's crimes, but they would also force the families to relive their trauma in excruciating detail. Plea deals would guarantee convictions but might leave unanswered questions about specific details of the crimes. After careful consideration and consultation with the victims' families, prosecutors agreed to the plea deal. Matthew would plead guilty to all charges and receive 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. He would never be eligible for release from prison. The decision reflected a pragmatic calculation about justice and finality. The families would have closure without the ordeal of lengthy trials. The convictions would be final, with no possibility of appeal or overturned verdicts. Matthew would die in prison, paying the ultimate price for his crimes. On March 2, 2016, Jesse Matthew appeared in court to formally enter his guilty pleas and receive his sentences. The courtroom was packed on sentencing day. Dan and Gil Harrington sat in the front row, their faces composed but their hands clasped tightly together. Behind them, supporters filled every available seat, while media representatives captured every moment of the proceeding that would finally bring justice for Morgan's murder. Judge Edward Hogshire methodically reviewed each charge and Matthew's guilty plea to each count. Matthew stood silently as the details of his crimes were read into the record, showing no visible emotion as he acknowledged his guilt in the deaths of 2 young women and the assault of a third. "Mr. Matthew," Judge Hogshire said, "you have pleaded guilty to capital murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault in the death of Morgan Dana Harrington. The court sentences you to life in prison without possibility of parole." Similar sentences followed for Hannah Graham's murder and the Fairfax assault, 4 consecutive life sentences that guaranteed Matthew would never again be free to harm another person. Gil Harrington was given the opportunity to address the court. Her voice was steady but heavy with emotion as she spoke about the daughter they had lost and the years of anguish that had finally reached a conclusion. "Morgan was full of life and adventure," she said. "She trusted people. She believed in the goodness of others. That trust was betrayed in the most horrible way possible. While we can never have our daughter back, we have some measure of peace, knowing that the person responsible will never hurt another family." Media reaction to Matthew's sentencing was immediate and overwhelming. Headlines across Virginia proclaimed "justice served" and "cold case solved," while national news outlets examined the role of DNA evidence in finally bringing resolution to cases that had seemed hopeless. The story resonated beyond Virginia's borders. Other states began reviewing their own cold cases, looking for opportunities to apply advanced DNA analysis to evidence that had been preserved for years. The technology that had solved Morgan's case offered hope for countless other families waiting for answers. University communities across the country paid close attention to the safety implications of the case. How had a predator operated undetected for so long? What institutional changes were needed to prevent similar tragedies? The questions led to comprehensive reviews of campus safety protocols and emergency response systems. For law enforcement, the case became a model of persistence and scientific advancement. The DNA evidence that had been preserved from the 2005 Fairfax assault had ultimately provided the key to solving 3 separate crimes. The investment in forensic technology and careful evidence preservation had literally paid dividends in justice. Public reaction was mixed between relief and anger. Relief that a dangerous predator was finally off the streets. Anger that he had been free to commit multiple crimes over nearly a decade. The case highlighted both the potential and the limitations of the criminal justice system. The University of Virginia implemented new safety measures, including enhanced lighting, improved emergency communication systems, and expanded late-night transportation services. These changes, inspired by both Morgan's and Hannah's cases, would benefit future generations of students. The Help Save the Next Girl Foundation, established by Dan and Gil Harrington in Morgan's memory, expanded dramatically after Matthew's conviction. The organization became a national voice for campus safety and support for families dealing with missing persons cases. Gil Harrington traveled across the country, speaking at universities, law enforcement conferences, and victim advocacy events. Her message was always the same: prevention, through awareness, support for affected families, and the importance of never giving up hope for justice. The Foundation's work influenced federal campus safety legislation and funding for improved emergency response systems. Statistics showed measurable improvements in campus safety reporting and response times at universities that had implemented the Foundation's recommendations. Dan Harrington used his medical background to advocate for better forensic science funding and training. His efforts helped secure state funding for enhanced DNA analysis capabilities, and improved evidence preservation protocols. The Foundation's annual reports documented its growing impact. Thousands of safety presentations delivered, millions of dollars raised for campus safety improvements, and countless families supported through the trauma of missing loved ones. But perhaps most importantly, the Foundation kept Morgan's memory alive in ways that transcended the criminal case. She became a symbol of resilience, of the power of love to overcome tragedy, and of the potential for positive change to emerge from even the darkest circumstances. The work continued because the need continued. Every year brought new cases of missing persons, new families thrust into the nightmare that the Harringtons had lived through, and new opportunities to prevent tragedies through improved safety measures. In 2019, prison medical reports revealed that Jesse Matthew had been diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. The diagnosis meant he would likely die in custody, bringing a final, irreversible conclusion to the case that had haunted Virginia for a decade. The news prompted complex reactions from those who had followed the case. Some saw it as fitting justice, a natural conclusion to a life dedicated to violence. Others viewed it as a reminder that even the worst criminals remain human beings facing mortality. For the Harrington family, Matthew's illness was both closure and anticlimactic. The man who had destroyed their lives would face his own mortality, but their daughter would still be gone. Justice had been served through the legal system, but ultimate justice remained beyond human reach. Medical ethicists debated the treatment obligations for violent criminals facing terminal illness. Matthew received the same standard of care as any other prisoner, but questions arose about the resources dedicated to extending the life of someone serving multiple life sentences. The diagnosis effectively sealed the case's legal chapter. There would be no appeals, no chance of overturned convictions, no possibility of eventual release. Matthew would die in prison, taking with him any secrets he had never revealed about his crimes. Prison officials maintained strict confidentiality about Matthew's condition and treatment, but the information had leaked through sources familiar with the case. The public's right to know competed with privacy considerations, even for someone convicted of violent crimes. Law enforcement agencies across Virginia adopted the Morgan Harrington case as a training model for cold case investigation and DNA evidence preservation. The case demonstrated how patience, scientific advancement, and careful evidence management could solve crimes that had seemed impossible to resolve. FBI training academies incorporated the case into their curricula, teaching new agents about the importance of evidence preservation and the potential for future technological advances to solve current cases. The message was clear: maintain hope, preserve evidence, and trust that science would eventually provide answers. State crime labs invested in expanded DNA analysis capabilities, using the case as justification for increased funding and staffing. The technology that had solved Morgan's murder was becoming routine, enabling investigators to tackle backlogs of cold cases with new confidence. Other states implemented similar evidence preservation protocols, recognizing that cases unsolvable today might yield to tomorrow's technology. The investment in proper storage and cataloging systems paid dividends as genetic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis techniques became more sophisticated. Academic researchers studied the case as an example of successful cold case investigation, publishing papers about the investigative techniques and scientific methods that had led to resolution. The knowledge gained would benefit future investigations and prevent other crimes from going unsolved. Police departments reported increased cooperation from crime victims willing to provide DNA samples and testimony, inspired by the knowledge that even old cases could eventually be solved. The case had restored faith in the potential for delayed justice. October 17, 2020, marked 11 years since Morgan Harrington had disappeared outside the Metallica concert. The anniversary brought hundreds of people to the University of Virginia campus for a vigil honoring her memory and celebrating the safety improvements inspired by her story. Candles flickered in the darkness as Gil Harrington addressed the crowd, her voice carrying across the campus that had become forever linked to her daughter's legacy. Students who had never known Morgan personally carried signs with her photo, understanding that her story had made their own college experience safer. Morgan believed in the goodness of people, Gil told the gathering. Even though that trust was betrayed, we choose to honor her memory by continuing to believe in each other, to look out for each other, and to create the kind of world she would have wanted to live in. Metallica had sent a representative to the vigil, maintaining their commitment to Morgan's memory more than a decade after her disappearance. The band's continued support had helped keep her story alive in popular culture and inspired other celebrities to engage with missing persons cases. University officials highlighted the safety improvements implemented since Morgan's death: enhanced lighting, improved emergency communication systems, expanded late-night transportation, and better coordination with local law enforcement. The changes had measurably improved campus safety and influenced universities across the country. As the candles were extinguished one by one, the crowd dispersed slowly, carrying with them the memory of a young woman whose death had sparked changes that would protect future generations. National forensic conferences began featuring the Morgan Harrington case as a landmark example of DNA evidence's power to solve cold cases. Expert presentations detailed the scientific techniques and investigative persistence that had led to Jesse Matthews' identification and conviction. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, director of the Virginia State Crime Lab, became a frequent speaker at these conferences, explaining how the case had influenced evidence preservation protocols and DNA analysis procedures nationwide. Her presentations emphasized the importance of maintaining hope for unsolvable cases. When we collected evidence from Morgan's case in 2010, Dr. Chen explained to conference audiences, we couldn't have imagined the technological advances that would eventually make identification possible. But we preserved everything, trusting that science would catch up to our hope for justice. The case had become a touchstone for discussions about genetic genealogy and familial DNA searching. Privacy advocates raised concerns about expanding DNA databases, while law enforcement argued that the technology offered hope for countless families waiting for answers about missing loved ones. Policymakers grappled with balancing public safety and individual privacy rights. The success of the Morgan Harrington case provided compelling evidence for expanded DNA collection and analysis, but civil liberties organizations warned about potential abuses of genetic information. International law enforcement agencies studied the case as well, adapting American DNA analysis techniques for their own cold case investigations. The scientific methods that had solved Morgan's murder were becoming global tools for justice. The conference presentations always ended with Morgan's photo, a reminder that behind every technological advance and policy debate was a real person whose life had been cut short, and a family whose love had transformed tragedy into positive change. As the case entered its second decade, the Harrington family reflected on the journey from devastating loss to hard-won justice to ongoing advocacy. Gil and Dan had aged visibly in the years since Morgan's death, but their commitment to her memory remained as strong as ever. In quiet moments, they spoke about the daughter they had lost, not just the victim of a terrible crime, but the vibrant young woman who had filled their lives with joy and laughter. They shared memories of her childhood adventures, her academic achievements, her dreams for the future that would never be realized. The Foundation's work had become their life's mission, but it could never fill the Morgan-shaped absence in their daily existence. Her childhood bedroom remained largely unchanged, a shrine to the life that had been stolen from them, and the grandchildren they would never have. Yet they found purpose in the knowledge that their advocacy had prevented other tragedies. University safety protocols implemented in Morgan's memory had demonstrably reduced campus crime rates. Emergency response systems inspired by her case had saved lives in other emergencies. The DNA evidence that had finally brought justice in Morgan's case continued yielding results in other investigations. Cold cases across Virginia and beyond were being solved using techniques perfected during the search for her killer. Jesse Matthews' name had become synonymous with the hidden evil that could lurk behind ordinary facades. His conviction served as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved through persistence and scientific advancement. Morgan's legacy lived on in the safety improvements, the solved cases, the supported families, and the countless young women who walked safer campuses because of the changes inspired by her story. The single DNA match that had unlocked everything served as proof that even the smallest trace of evidence, carefully preserved, could eventually reveal the truth that seemed lost forever. On a quiet morning in their Roanoke home, Gil and Dan Harrington sat in Morgan's old room, sunlight streaming through windows that had once framed her teenage dreams. On the dresser, her photograph smiled back at them, not the missing person poster that had become so familiar, but a candid shot of their daughter laughing, her whole life still ahead of her. 11 years had passed since that October night, when Morgan stepped outside for fresh air and never returned. 11 years of grief, investigation, legal proceedings, and advocacy work that had transformed their personal tragedy into a force for positive change. The community that had rallied around their search for Morgan continued to support their foundation's work. Donations still arrived regularly, often accompanied by notes from parents expressing gratitude for campus safety improvements or from students who felt safer because of protocols implemented in Morgan's memory. Jesse Matthew remained in prison, his health declining, but his convictions standing as permanent, testament to the power of DNA evidence and investigative persistence. He would never again have the opportunity to hurt another family the way he had destroyed theirs. The case had become part of Virginia's legal and cultural history, a story told in law schools about the evolution of forensic science, in journalism classes about responsible crime reporting, and in victim advocacy programs about the power of families to create positive change from devastating loss. As they sat together in the morning light, Gil and Dan found comfort in knowing that Morgan's story would continue inspiring safety improvements, supporting other families, and demonstrating that love could overcome even the darkest evil. Her memory lived on not just in their hearts, but in every safer campus, every solved cold case, and every family that found hope in the knowledge that justice, however delayed, could still prevail. The question that had haunted a community for 6 years, what happened to Morgan Harrington, had finally been answered, but her legacy would endure far longer than the crime that had taken her life.